Well, as we all know, the Brexit generated discussions about the future of the European Union throughout Europe and even beyond Europe. We also know that the European Union have underwent several crises in its not too long history, but many argue that this is different. This present crisis is different, this is deeper, this is something which cannot be so easily overcome. Well, why should we bother? As we all know, the EU is a monster. It takes 1% of the GDP from every country. It has a horrible bureaucracy of some 30,000 employees, which is approximately the same size of crowd employed by the public sector in Csongrád County. So, but anyway, it's a regulative institution or organization or something like this, and it takes some of the sovereignty of the member states. So why should we bother? Fully fledged nation states led by the enlightened and benevolent leaders could flourish, one might say. Well, I'm a historian, and I am convinced that this is not what the historical record shows. Nation states are not as innocent as they often are claimed to be. As we all know, again, the European Union was conceived as a kind of peace project and not by an accident. The European state system, which was created in the, say, 17th century after the Westphalian peace treaties, so the European state system had a kind of inherent potential of conflicts. And these conflicts, which with the arrival of ideologies, first of all nationalism and communism, led to increasingly destructive wars, especially in the 20th century. One might say that making war was a norm in Europe for a long period of time and the normal functioning of the European state system. Well, the communism is over, but the nationalism is with us, and it's even on the rise in Europe. I would like to remind you that Srebrenica, which was the place of genocide in the 1990s, so Srebrenica is some 200 kilometers from Szeged, which is approximately the same distance and the same distance as we should cover if we travel to Budapest from Szeged. So, of course, nationalism is always what the other people do, but I should confess that in Hungary, the nationalist discourse is also very lively, and the major target of this discourse is the European Union, and with this, the West. I would underline this. This is a major difference between Britain and Hungary. If Britain leaves the European Union, Britain simply opts for another path of development based on Western values. But if Hungary withdraws from the EU, that's at the expense of Western values and Western institutions. The Hungarian Prime Minister slips into anti-Western rhetoric on a daily basis, and the semi-official media of the governing Fidesz party is full of that type of delivery. So, this is my first point. I would like to make another point I will keep it short, which is related to a much broader issue, a kind of global issue, but it is also related to the Brexit and the fate of the European Union. I am convinced about this. And this is climate change. This is a big step into another direction, I know. Climate change is, one might argue, is the single greatest threat that the world faces today. Earth's average temperature has risen by 0.8 degrees Celsius over the past century, and temperatures are projected to rise another 1.1 to 6.5 degrees Celsius over the next, say, 80 or 100 years. If scientific studies prove to be right, some regions will become inhabitable, others unfertile, and regarding the continuous population growth, this may lead to disastrous situations with nations unable to supply their inhabitants with the basic needs. Thus, finding international solutions to the problem in the immediate term is of major importance. How is it related? How is this problem related to the European Union? The EU has been at the forefront of international efforts towards a global climate change. The EU had a kind of leading, or some say mediator role in climate change diplomacy, and had shown leadership and unity during the Paris Climate Change Agreement negotiations. The EU is mainly perceived by many to lead by example by being a role model for other state actors. We might plausibly argue that without the European Union, without the European Union's effective contribution, badly needed further treaties might not be reached easily. This claim is supported by two recent developments. One of these developments is the Brexit. After the Brexit, several decision makers in Britain argued that the EU's relatively strong environmental protection, the relatively strong environmental protection measures implemented by the EU should be abandoned by Britain, and that's why the competitiveness of Britain can be restored, which would suffer by leaving the EU. And of course, the other major development in that respect is the pledge of Donald Trump, which is, as we all know, that the United States would leave the Paris climate change agreement, and the United States would not support anymore the United Nations efforts to hinder climate change worldwide. So I think these new developments just underline the paramount importance of the EU in this respect in the near or far future, because these kind of international agreements cannot be reached simply by the negotiations of several dozens or more than 100 governments. They are carried out much, much more effectively if an organization or a country takes the leading role. And the United States would not be the one, even though a great polluter, as we all know, would not take this leading role in the near future. Much of the debate about the EU, and these are my closing remarks, so much of the debate about the EU revolves around the issue of sovereignty of the member states, and well, I think there are very serious arguments that the loss of some of the sovereignty in exchange for what the EU delivers, might be a very lucrative one for many countries. Obviously, there are counter arguments as well. So my remarks could only superficially touch upon these issues, but might have demonstrated the significance of Brexit and its impact of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's quite interesting. So it sets the tone for an interesting debate, because I probably disagree with everything you said, precisely because I do think the nation state was not a bad idea. A lot of good things came out of it. The problem, of course, was Germany, which had problems with being a nation state, whereas France, Italy, the UK, and even Austria-Hungary probably were quite efficient arrangements from the Westphalian system. But we can debate this further, I think, which it's an interesting source of reflection. I think the other thing I feel about the European Union, well, I don't feel about it, I think about it, is that it probably was quite a nice idea at one time in the 1950s about some means within Europe to solve the endless problem of France and Germany, which goes back to at least 1870, really. But, I mean, a lot of European problems are still being hidden or disguised within the framework of the European Union. And actually what's happened, in the last decade or so, particularly from the most recent financial crisis, is a re-emergence of things that have been repressed. And the trouble with repression is that you don't really address problems that still remain. And some of those problems have been rendered problematic by the drive of a European elite towards an ever closer union. And Brexit is a response to that, actually. And it's a response that is predictable. It's also part of a bigger response that's global to an elite ideology that came on very strongly after the Cold War. And it's interesting perhaps to think about that for a minute, because we begin with the end of history in 1990, really. There's a number of books written about this, famously Francis Fukuyama. The thinking was in the 1990s that powerfully fed into the whole notion of Schengen, widening and deepening within the European project, was that it was generally held that we were in an era of the triumph or the necessity of everybody moving towards a liberal global market arrangement, whether you were in South Korea or South Europe or Southeast Europe or Southwest Europe. You were all moving in the same teleological direction. And it was towards some version of what the American political science Robert Dahl called polyarchy, or the idea that if you're going to be modern, if you're going to be developed, you need to have a middle class. The middle class is inexorably moving towards a liberal democratic arrangement. It might be slightly culturally different in China or Korea or Singapore, but nevertheless, the market framework is what's there. And therefore, there's no need for ideology anymore. the line at the time was all isms have become wasms, and we're in a time of Zeit without Geist. Well, I think the Geist has come back quite strongly, really, and the Geist is that actually this end of history without ideology was itself a very strong ideology that wanted to get rid of any understandings of attachment, of community in some ways, and wanted to promote the resistance to Trump that's appeared recently. How could they possibly vote for an understanding of America that is no longer progressive? How could we abandon this internationalist understanding? Well, actually, quite easily, because for a number of years now, since at least 2001, the world has not been going in this teleological direction, and other factors have powerfully emerged. And the problem with the European Union is that it's become otiose. I mean, so when I'm going to talk about the UK in this context and the way people are thinking, this is not because I'm anti-European or I don't believe in Europe. Of course I do. Europe is where the Enlightenment began. Europe is a diverse, culturally interesting, and dynamic potential region of the world. Under the European Union, it's become sclerotic, middle-aged, or gerontocratic. To be led by someone as charismatically light as Jean-Claude Juncker's is a depressing world to be part of, I think. So we need, if we're talking about Europe, we're talking about a culturally diverse arrangement that has interacted dialectically over time. The European Union, as the professor said, was part of a peace process. Well, actually, it wasn't really. Peace was brought to Europe by force of arms, by the American Allied Army. Europe was a project that evolved after that as a means of trying to solve the differences between France and Germany. Well, we can safely say, I think, that France and Germany are never going to go to war again. So what is the purpose of the European Union? If it was to be a more flexible, market-oriented arrangement, then perhaps there is some sustainability in it. And why I want to talk about Brexit and what the British might do is because there are two possible means of Brexit. One is soft and one is hard. I want to go into those. But one of the reasons why soft Brexit might not occur is the way in which the European Union elite doesn't want to tolerate the notion that you could do it differently, that you might not want to force ever closer union, ever closer integrated federalism, ever closer adherence to the rule of a European elite that is really not very accountable. The Commission proposes and the Parliament disposes. An understanding of representative institutions that is antithetical to any understanding of parliamentary democracy that I know of. So if Europe is to survive, it's got to get serious, not about climate change, but about things like employment for its youth, about the idiocy of the current currency arrangements that have made Southern Europe a disaster zone economically, and think about how we reorientate Europe for a new Enlightenment Europe that is able to respond creatively to the global challenges that face us. So in that context, I'd just like to say a few words about what Brexit looks like, really. So like Hungary, Britain needs a foreign policy and an economic policy geared to long-term interests. And this has become an urgent task. How Britain does this will obviously affect Europe, but how it affects Europe will depend very much upon how Europe responds to Britain, given the economic interconnections that currently obtain. But what's quite significant about the British moment of Brexit was that it was a big bang event. There was a referendum, there was a decision. It will, whatever the constitutional challenges at the moment, it will occur, if necessary, with another election. Unlike the European Union, which was not a big bang event, it's been an interminable process, and that's part of its problem, really. It's a bureaucratic, endless bureaucracy without accountability. And it's in that context that the Leave campaign presented itself. Primarily, as Professor Tomka said, it was about sovereignty, about taking back control. Well, I don't necessarily think that's such a bad thing, really, for anybody to, as a citizen of a state, to have accountability from your elected representatives. That's what I understand by a properly functioning parliamentary representative democracy. And what that means is that I still have some liberty, some freedom to accept the decisions that have been made within that process. The problem with the European arrangement is that it tends to be an arrangement based on European law with a bureaucracy in Brussels that is not directly accountable to the members of individual political arrangements, states, really. And this kind of incoherence is what the Brexit moment advertised. So if Britain will leave Europe, there are two contested positions that have emerged on how best to do this, hard or soft Brexit. Hard Brexit would involve a clean break. The UK would give up membership of the single market for goods and services, but take back control of its budget, laws, and borders, which, well, I don't see that that's necessarily a big issue and shouldn't be for anybody who's interested in the idea of the functional basis of a state, which is to have some kind of coherent border controls around it. I mean, even Europe really needs borders, and part of the problem with the immigration crisis is that it doesn't. Soft Brexit would see the UK then outside Europe, but inside the single market, with some tariff-free access. The UK would still be subject to some EU laws and regulations, freedom of labour movement, and contributions to the EU budget. This is the trade deal that Norway and Iceland have as members of the European Economic Area. Evidently, the European Commission, in the shape of President Jean-Claude Juncker and Chief Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier, wish to punish Britain for questioning the validity of the model that I've briefly outlined. This, together with the default bureaucratic position that any trade deal has to involve free movement of labour, a deal no current British politician could plausibly entertain and win an election, means that hard Brexit becomes the default political option, even though this could hurt the EU more than the UK economy. In other words, a hard Brexit would arise from Europe turning its back on Britain, not the other way around. So whatever happens, Brexit means the UK can potentially free its economy from the EU's regulatory restrictions and layers of bureaucracy that rendered any trade deal an interminable negotiation process. The difficulty, and I'm going to talk about free trade agreements as the way the world works now, and why Europe is increasingly, marginalized in terms of global capital flows, is because making a trade deal with Europe is a nightmare. The Canadians spent more than 7 years trying to negotiate a reasonable deal in terms of access to the European market. But trying to get a consensus with 28 states, well, even the Canadians, who are, one of the most pacific people on the planet, and I was educated there as well, they almost gave up, and it was almost stymied by the vote of Wallonia, a province of Belgium, could screw up a treaty 7 years in the making. And it's still not, although it's been signed, it's still not being ratified, because 38 national parliaments have also got to sign up to it. So whatever economic advantage the UK enjoyed from access to the single market, it clearly comes with these kinds of trade-offs. Whilst post-Brexit Britain cannot ignore a market of 500 million people on its doorstep, the UK can, if nothing else, free itself from the encumbrances of EU membership. Brexit, however, has left a policy vacuum. The immediate aftermath saw stock exchanges fall, the pound drop, the potential for a Brexit-induced recession, which didn't happen. The Trump phenomenon was predicted to go in the same way, and the market came back even more quickly than the British one. So, nevertheless, there are some, the classic journals of the Prime Minister described as the cosmopolitan, transnational Davoisie, the citizens of the world who are citizens of nowhere. The Economist and the Financial Times, the house journals of Davos, were not impressed. They thought Britain was going in a liberal direction, which would make it a poorer and weaker country. Those of a more libertarian disposition argued that a hard Brexit would be a golden opportunity for a free trade bonanza. And a lot of this is about trade and free trade being the basis of what Britain wants, without free movement of labor, which is what a free trade agreement world would enable. So the problem with May is that she wants free trade. She thinks that she can be an advocate for free trade. At the same time, she wants an industrial policy to rebuild the manufacturing sector in the UK, which has been down forever. So there are three options that Britain currently has. One is one advocated by libertarian economists associated with Economists for Brexit, Patrick Minford at Cardiff and Gerald Lyons at a think tank I have some associations with in London called Policy Exchange. They particularly favour the idea of unilateral tariff disarmament. The idea that we remove ourselves from the market, we come under WTO rules rather than European rules, and therefore we take goods at the world trade prices. We are open. We just become an open economy. And that the basis of that would allow, given Minford estimates that embracing global market prices rather than living inside the EU would be worth about £40 a week, about €50 perhaps, to the average household. Not bad. The government could also cut the corporate rate of tax that the government holds on businesses below its current rate to down to 10%. This is called the British nuclear option in terms of keeping banks and financial institutions based in London, which is the basis of the UK economy, really. So cutting tax rates on corporate businesses, your Amazons, your Googles, your HSBC banks, would encourage London, as a basis for European institutions, regardless of the question of passport rights, which people like Goldman Sachs endlessly raise. And the model here is somewhere like Singapore, where I worked for a long time, which was not a bad place to live, got a very open economy, rose from about a GDP of very poor country in the 50s and 60s to being perhaps one of the richest places on the planet at the moment. How did it do that? By this kind of model, being an open trading environment, encouraging investment by multinationals, and turning itself into a giant export processing zone and financial services center, which allows business to enjoy largely tariff-free access to whatever the world has to offer. That said, of course, Singapore is just a city-state of about 5 million people. It has a surprising also number of state-owned enterprises, like Singapore Airlines, for instance, and a very active economic development board that it involves itself with sovereign wealth funds. Moreover, the problem for this kind of model, because I'm not saying that I've got a Brexit solution. Basically, I'm a skeptic and a conservative, really. So moreover, this creative destruction that the unilateral free trade disarmament model would imply would have implications for an economic downside. Obviously, if you're going to open your market to everything from China, including cheaper steel, it's going to destroy the steel industry in South Wales, where I originated. And it's going to hit the northeast. All areas that voted leave but might lose jobs to China and India. Such an outcome would be electoral poison. It explains why May then wants to re-examine some form of industrial strategy to look at a program for balancing economic growth and the geography of economic growth in the UK. So the alternative world that Britain's looking at more closely now with the Secretary for Brexit, Liam Fox and David Davis, the alternative world of free trade agreements then is what is being looked at. Well, what are they? What is this world? It's an interesting one. In contrast to the unilateral tariff reduction, the more dynamic economies in the global trading order, especially those of the Asia-Pacific, have developed an elaborate regime of bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral FTAs. To enter this world, the UK would first need to establish its own relationship with the EU, with the WTO, as distinct from its relationships with the WTO negotiated through the EU. The UK then would need to negotiate high-quality FTAs with a range of potential trade partners. These could be in Asia, if Britain was pivoting towards Asia rather than towards Europe, or a recalibrated version of the Anglosphere. Canada, United States, post-Trump or with Trump, Australia and New Zealand would be easier to make free trade agreements with than probably China, which is being courted, or South Korea, which is also in the framework. So, but the site of the major FTA world development is Asia. So, and I just briefly talk about this and then talk about the other alternative we could look at. So, East and Southeast Asia have maintained growth rates across the region in excess of 5% over the last decade. Foreign direct investment, openness to global protection networks, and FTAs have been crucial to this growth. This pattern of agreements, which evolved with the rise of China in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s, increasingly links the economies of the Asia-Pacific, the United States, and India, the real growth motor of the moment. And it was interesting pre-Trump that Clinton and Obama saw the Asia-Pacific, not passé Europe, as the region where America should be invested and dynamic. FTAs, so the more dynamic and export-oriented economies in the region have negotiated a range of agreements covering goods, services, manufacturing, agriculture, and economic collaboration. South Korea has 15, Singapore has 32, China has developed 23 over the last 20 years. These arrangements need careful negotiation and take years. The Canadian experience is one with Europe. Australia began its negotiations with China in 2005 and didn't conclude them till 2015. So South Korea, China have expressed interest in free trade agreements with the UK. It would be easier to do than with Europe. They would need careful sector-by-sector negotiation. And the problem that the UK faces is Canada has 300 trade negotiators dealing with the sector-by-sector issues with Europe. Britain hasn't got any. So, you know, that's a bit of a weakness. Or the civil service needs to develop a few very quickly. Moreover, the geopolitics of free trade agreements is also important from this perspective, whether you're in Europe or out of Europe. The noodle bowl of Asian FTAs throws geopolitics into sharp focus. China considers the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the 10 states of Southeast Asia, of which Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines were founding members, and subsequently Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Myanmar, Brunei all joined it. So it's a 10-member organization that theoretically has driven integration across Asia in terms of markets. Actually, it's increasingly become dominated by China and to a lesser extent Japan, because China and Japan are the big players, as are South Korea, in the Asia-Pacific market in terms of technology, manufacturing, etc., and invest and take resources from Southeast Asia. But it serves China's interests that the ASEAN model of regional comprehensive economic partnership backed by China is the model for greater Asian free trade integration. This serves as the basis of China's so-called Belt and Road model, one belt, one road, integrating Southeast Asia, South Asia, potentially parts of Europe, into a greater sinospheric hemisphere. Reflecting and informing this partnership is China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. The bank involves 50 primarily Asian members, but includes the UK and Australia, and also significantly Germany. The AIIB could prove a significant boon to the integration of Southeast Asia as a single market, facilitating a free flow of goods and services. And the UK, with its long associations with that region, could find itself participating in this growth strategy. This scenario has geopolitical trade-offs, however. Xi Jinping, the current Chinese leader, his dream, the China dream, is to integrate the smaller ASEAN economies into a sinocentric regional production network. In fact, China's proactive economic diplomacy in Southeast Asia goes hand in hand with its geopolitical regional ambitions to be the dominant power in the region, particularly in the South China Seas. So its strategy is to imbricate or link its neighbors in a web of incentives that increase their dependence and raises the ante for calling China over either territorial or economic disputes. Don't mess with China. We'll give you investment as long as you go along with the regional plan. So if the Philippines objects to Chinese structures in the South China Sea, it finds itself cut off and under pressure. Even when it goes to the UN, you know, one of those great international organizations that now looks increasingly exhausted, they find in the Philippines' favor against the, China's incursion into Philippine territorial waters. The new president, who didn't have much to do with this process, thinks this decision in the UN courts is merely a piece of paper. He goes to China, says, really, we want a deal. He immediately gets $13 billion worth of investment. This is Geopolitics 101. It's China's view of regional playing. It's called the carrot and stick. China's Belt and Road model, moreover, sits at variance, interestingly, with the US proposal under Obama for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. a key feature of the US pivot to Asia since 2011, which is now very much on hold. And one effect of Trump, we talk about the European response, but the big response is going to be in Asia because, one country which would have welcomed Trump is everything he said about not having a Trans-Pacific partnership is China. So in that context, what about bilateral trade with China from a British point of view, from a Brexit position? And May just announced today it's the beginning of a golden era with China. But even before recent decisions over Hinkley Point, British Sino-UK relations had entered an era with bilateral trade worth 75 billion in 2015, likely to go up further in the next few years, where London accounts for 2/3 of China currency trades, the renminbi. However, as we know from the decision of the nuclear reactor to be built at Hinkley Point, May nearly pulled out of the deal because she wasn't sure whether it was more political than economic. This kind of problem with dealing with the Chinese corporate beast is an interesting one. And it reflects the fact that the corporate animals that emerged from reform in China in the 1990s of loss-making state enterprises were curious corporate beasts, at the same time commercial and linked to the party state. The split personalities of powerful reconstituted state enterprises like the China Development Bank, Chinalco, CNOOC have raised questions of security and national interest through their investment strategies in the US and Australia as well. And the problem is, when you're signing a deal with China, are you starting a deal with a company or are you starting a deal with a state? And what does that mean for your own control of your infrastructure or your telecoms or your cyber security? So dealing with China could be both something of a mixed blessing, really. Maybe better to go back to Europe, but we'll see. There is one other alternative, which I'd like to put forward, which is the Anglospheric alternative, which is a phrase that I first got from John, actually, a long time ago. Given the geopolitical complexity of dealing with China, it might be better in the short term for the UK to focus on FTAs with developed economies in the Commonwealth and the US. They significantly share similar constitutional and economic practices, and they share a common language, and they share a common law, which is different from European law, and is not a utopian project, as I would see ever closer European Union to be. Indeed, by 2015, states following some version of Anglo-liberal market values, coupled with rule of law and property rights, enjoyed both high standards of living and were amongst the more attractive places in the world to live. So this could be the basis for a revamped kind of Anglosphere, what James C. Bennett called CANZUK, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, Australia, or it could even now become CANZUKUS with the US as well, in a revamped Western alliance. As with Canada and Australia, the US and the UK share common law and liberal market values. This could accord the basis, in conjunction with the Commonwealth, the Commonwealth countries, not only for evolving economic linkages, but also geopolitical ones in terms of a shared language, a shared institutional culture, shared sovereign institutions, and the rule of law. But what about the consequence of Brexit for not ever closer union, but for the balance of power in Europe, which has become what is evident once again, and which was, as your professor said, the basis of a lot of, there was good things about the nation states, but there was also a severe downside in terms of war, particularly the 20th century. So one consequence of Brexit for the balance of power in Europe is the role of NATO and European defense. Here again, one of the problems with the European Union was its lack of investment, its belief in transnational normativism, international norms, international law, without any kind of European defense force. And obviously, one of the points that Trump made that played not only with, a right American constituency, but with, liberals as well, or the more thoughtful liberals, was that, US picks up the cost for European defense and has since 1945, and it's allowed Europe to play around with its fanciful notions of ever closer union without dealing with the reality of power politics. And we're back with a real power politic environment, which bears certain resemblances for the struggle for mastery in Europe in the 19th century, the subject of a brilliant book by an Oxford historian called A.J.P. Taylor at one time. So already transformed with the changed reality of the post-9/11 world, when we were suddenly back in the world of ideology, or at least we were back in a world of power politics, Western powers and regional institutions appear either exhausted, distracted, or weak. Thus, while the European Union considered the whole notion of geopolitics old-fashioned, geopolitics has happened on its doorstep. The recrudescence of identity politics everywhere, Russian irredentism, China's emergence as a great but authoritarian power, together with the continued turmoil in the Middle East, intimates not the end of history, but the revenge of the revisionist powers, and the return, of course, of geopolitics. History then, after a brief nap, reawakened and started saying what's going on, requiring states, not ever closer unions of regional uncertainty, to reassess how they conduct themselves in an uncertain, anarchical international system where only three verities still prevail, namely diplomacy, alliances, and war. In contrast with revisionist powers like Russia and China, Europe lacks the capacity to assert its interests or deal decisively with problems like either the Syrian civil war or the rise of ISIS. Since the end of the Cold War, a pragmatic or realist view of international politics and a prudent assessment of national interests by European countries within maybe an alliance arrangement like a union has been honored only in the breach. By contrast, if we look back to the Westphalian system when there were smart realist counselors around, they would say, you don't address yourself in terms of idealist transnational utopian schemes. The great sort of thinker about European realism, who was also a promoter of liberty in his discourse, is of course Niccolo Machiavelli, who says, I write about things as they are, not how they ought to be. And we have to deal with a world as it is, which is not overly concerned with climate change. It's deeply concerned with employment, power, structure, and the way you project yourself in terms of a nationally defined interest. If Europe's not thinking of its national interests, then Russia certainly is, and so is China. And if you don't start to, or if Europeans don't start to engage with this in the context of NATO's eastward expansion after 1990 and Putin's recent reclamation of the Crimea, the pretense of idealism often ignites as one great European political thinker of the late 16th century, Justus Lipsius, who was the basis of the European Parliament building, but wrote a very skeptical book about reason of state, really, called the Politica, argued that if you're going to be effective, you don't do what is idealistically the best, but what might be the best in the circumstances. Ultimately, in troubling cases like Syria or the Crimea, It requires, somebody like Lipsius would have said in the 1600s, it requires statesmen who recognize that they must do not what is beautiful to say, but what is necessary in practice. Unfortunately, such an appreciation has yet to dawn on the Bruxellians, a name that your president gave to the Eurocrats. The geopolitical consequences of Britain's engaging with Kanzuk will potentially weaken NATO, whilst European defence arrangements absent the UK with a Trump USA resembles diplomacy without a military, which, as Frederick the Great, another interesting European figure, observed was like conducting an orchestra without instruments. Post-referendum UK, to conclude, has opened a Pandora's box that requires careful handling. If Brexit is to fashion a positive global event rather than an extended damage limitation exercise. Examining the options for unilateral free trade and free trade agreements suggests that some version of the developing FTA model probably offers the UK an environment in which to embrace global market prices rather than the regulatory intense environment of Europe. In this context, the fact that English is the language of international trade and business, and that the UK can draw upon the Anglospheric connections with the US, Canada, India, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand, means that the UK already enjoys a comparative advantage in dealing on a global rather than a regional basis. And that's where I'll finish now. And that should be provocative enough to give you plenty of ammunition to shoot this to pieces.